Hi, my name is Tobi and I am a recovering pornography and fantasy addict. Um, the addiction for me started when I was around 8 years old. And I know based on other stories that I have heard from other people who are in recovery, mine is a little bit different in that it didn't wreck my life in a super noticeable way. I was never homeless. I was never fully unable to function. So like the impacts were not necessarily clear to others, but I think the heaviest impact that it had on my life was on relational factors. I had a lot of anxiety and fear, and there was much relational brokenness as a result of the addiction, because when you learn from a young age about sexuality before you're supposed to, that sort of stuff just applies to everything in your life and the way that you relate to friends, especially to authority figures. There was a lot of distrust because of my expectations of them based on what I had learned in like the scripts of pornography. So there was a lot of senses of unsafeness in my life. And I also escaped a lot through fantasy. And there was a very harsh contrast between like the reality that I was living and the fantasy that I had created in my mind, which like it was different, but also the fantasy wasn't necessarily good because a lot of the time it was also based off of twisted ideas that I had been learning from the content that I was consuming. And recovery for me has also been a little bit different. It wasn't necessarily, it was not through a 12-step program. So I actually do not have a lot of the language or even know what all of the steps are, to be honest. So I may be referencing frameworks that are a little bit different, but I will try to explain them as I go. And I'm open to questions as well. I think I'll start with like an understanding that I have of addiction that has also, I'm also a psychology student at U Ottawa. And so that also strongly impacts my understanding of both, my journey as well as recovery. And so a description that I really appreciated in one of my textbooks talking about the concept of addiction that also applies to mental illness is that it's a contrast an addition of both biological factors as well as stress and trauma that can result in kind of like hitting like a threshold. So like if like the threshold for addiction is here, there's some people that could have like this much biological underlying and this much stress and they don't hit the threshold, but maybe someone had a lot more of a biological underlying than like a lot of less stress would be necessary in order to put them over the threshold. And so in that way, both the biological factors that some of us may have been born with a tendency, whether from our parents or from wherever else, to lean towards addiction, that that life factors like trauma and stress also have a significant impact on whether we become addicted or not. So I think that's been important for me to understand as well, that in order to find freedom from addiction, that the trauma or stress also needs to be dealt with. And so I think for me, my journey was alone for a long time. I think for the first 5 years or so, no one knew. I slowly told like some friends, which wasn't terribly helpful because some of them were also in a similar addiction. It's actually crazy how many 11 and 12-year-olds are addicted to porn. But eventually, I think in grade 9, 10-ish, I talked to a mentor of mine and came fully clean to someone who's actually able to help. And so I walked with her in accountability for a number of years now, and have also sought counseling because I found that to be necessary too, but I will return to that later. I think, I tried to be abstinent for a while in my life with quite varying success. And I've only found, the most both like healing and length of sobriety within the last couple of years, the most significant, which is right now. I've clean for a year and 3 months as of yesterday, actually. So that's exciting. So me and my mentor decided to go through a book as of not this past November, but the year before, and I kind of have it with me because I'm going to reference it. It is called No Stones, Women Redeemed from Sexual Addiction. And it actually does talk about a lot of 12-step concepts. And so through reading that book, I learned that for most sexual addicts, there is underlying trauma related to sexual abuse for the majority of them. I consider myself fortunate to not be one of that 80% of sex addicts who experience sexual abuse, but many of them also experience other forms of abuse. But interestingly enough, according to the data presented here, like 100% had experienced some sort of abandonment trauma, which can be harder to recognize because abuse is like the bad things that happened, which is also hard to come to terms with. But abandonment is like recognizing what you never had. So this kind of like need that had not been met, this hole in your heart. And I think for me, that was a very strong maintaining factor. And I think when I was able to acknowledge that, realizing this and putting a name to the place of hurt and the hole in my heart that I was trying to fill was incredibly helpful. And it linked together like the hurt of my family of origin, as well as the addiction that I'd struggled with, which I had very much considered separate and two kind of separate parts of my testimony and story. So I don't think it's cause and effect. Like, I don't think I can be like, yes, because this one thing happened, I searched this thing on the internet and ended up addicted. Like, I still have not been able to establish a specific causal line, which I think is fine. But I think it's, important to recognize the impacts of those things. And then also, as I have been aware of, the trauma of abandonment and other, emotional trauma in my life, I realized the significance of triggers in my recovery. And so triggers are events or feelings that link back to traumatic experiences. And often like they can happen without you realizing it. And as I've become more aware of them, I have realized that most times that I find myself wanting to turn to pornography and I find myself just like restless and like lonely or frustrated or whatever it is often because I had been triggered without realizing it. And so dealing with that underlying trauma became quite central to my recovery. And I also learned, like, as well through counseling, that when we react to trauma, it's not as our current selves. Like, it's not me, Tobi, who's 20 and somewhat knows how to handle stuff in life, but we're actually reacting from the emotional place that we were in during our trauma. So as I'm reacting to that, I'm reacting as a child who is hurting and confused and feels like they have no sense of control. Not that I have any real sense of control, but it's just different. And so I guess the question of, okay, so what do you do about that? And I found like the answer to be in like healing from trauma as well as inner child work. So I went through the book that I mentioned with my mentor and came to understanding a framework for addiction that involved like maintenance by trauma and continuing to have broken relationships out of that as well. And so I found that there was a lot of hurt that needed to be processed. So I went into processing a lot of it, both like with my mentor as we went through that book. Like some chapters it took more than a month to go through just because I had to sit in the heaviness and pain. And I think my roommates could also attest to that there were lots of months of just like crying and sitting in it and be like, I don't know how we can ever get through this. And I also, started counseling actually for a different reason. I went to counseling for anxiety, and then I was just like conveniently in therapy when I'm like, wow, look at all this trauma. Maybe I can bring that there too. And so that was also very helpful. And so, I guess I've learned that instead of ignoring or numbing those hurts, it was necessary to face them and to run to God with them and to sit with him in that vulnerability instead of coping as I had been used to, which was by turning to the addiction, by numbing it with pornography, and also the various tendencies that I had developed relationally as well, as far as like looking to other people for attention and gratification. My toxic trait was re-downloading Tinder for the very cheap attention that was so prevalent on that app. But so stuff like that isn't necessarily the addiction itself, but a lot of coping mechanisms that had arisen from it. But in order to avoid using those, I found that I actually had to sit in the hurt and actually work through it. And so as I was sort of overwhelmed by the needs that had not been met throughout childhood by parents or whoever else, I think the biggest realization that was significant to me that was that God was able to meet all of my needs, that he is the constant that I did not have in the chaos of childhood, that he does not leave or forsake me and is never emotionally unavailable, and that even now I can come to him as a hurting child in anger and in fear, and that he will welcome me with open arms and meet me where I am at. And so in this process of, looking back on the hurting child, I guess it has also been significant to be forgiving the past versions of myself, because I have found that, like, as I look back, I do not like any other version of me except where I am right now, which is not terribly helpful for healing. I can look back and be like, wow, 14-year-old Tobi, she really sucked. Like, I think that, like, my 14-year-old self is like the hardest to forgive, but I think as I've been learning of both of the impact of, like, the trauma and the coping that I'm doing now, I think realizing that that has been a factor in my life this entire time has allowed me to have compassion for what I have gone through and been coping with, rather than leaning into the shame and self-hatred that really just further fueled the addiction. And so, I mentioned my 14-year-old self, that is both the hardest to forgive, but also was in the most pain. Like, I think that was a very difficult year for me. I lost a family member for the first time, and I had never had to cope with something like that before. And so there was a lot more, chaos within my family, chaos within myself. And I just both shut down and ceased to have a will to live or feel anything, but also, like, kind of dove more headfirst into the addiction, and it became more relational. And I was involved with someone who was a lot older than me, who was also in a relationship, and it was just very, very messy. And it was still completely hidden at this point, and no one knew about it. This was before I had talked to mentors. And so I think looking back, especially on that period of my life where I'm just kind of tempted to be like, ugh, remember being that awful, and just being able to be looking back on compassion, to be able to love and accept myself throughout the years, so that I can also do so now. Because so I think I found a lot of healing in that as well, and have found that it's also very freeing to forgive myself. And I think that I had found it, it was another part of my story is, like, accepting the grace of God. And I knew that that was, like, a very beautiful and overwhelming thing. I actually have a tattoo that says grace on my wrist, and that was a huge part of my faith journey. But I don't think I was ever really able to extend that grace to myself from myself, and still held things against me, which also resulted in a lot of shame, which does not help healing either. And so I think healing has looked like looking backwards and loving and accepting myself, and trying to see myself how God sees me. And I think he's still opening my eyes to that, and seeing how God has been working in me both then and now. And so I guess there's various practical ways of doing that. I actually have a little poster thing above my bed. I got my roommate, who is here, to, like, hand letter this word that says redeemed. And around it, I have a bunch of pictures of myself in various ages of childhood. I don't have pictures of my teenage self yet. We're working towards that. So I think it's been, significant for me to acknowledge that I am able to be redeemed, and that God is still making me into who he created me to be, and I'm not beyond repair. So it's not necessarily wanting to be restored to who I was as an innocent, perfect child, because I don't really believe that I was either, just due to the existence of sin, but wanting to be restored into who God made me to be, which has been, significant. And so I think this kind of, like, healing work is also, like, very long-term, and I kind of imagine it as, like, happening, like, in parallel with also the practical work of staying sober. And I've definitely found it exhausting to be feeling all of the things, but it's significant to not do it alone, because I've been able to lean on my roommates, my mentors, my counselor, and above all, definitely, like, God as well, to just ground me and to give me wisdom and support on the days that are harder. And I think, above all, God is the reason for all of my peace. Like, when I am anxious, he is my peace. He is forgiveness in the face of bitterness and anger. He is my constant, and reassures me that he will never leave me or forsake me as I fear the abandonment of being let down. And so I guess, as far as what that looks like, as well as some of the fruit of the healing that I've experienced, I've found myself a lot more able to sit in the pain of the abandonment, the hurt, fear, trauma, and allow God to see me through the triggers and to lean in and process the hurt rather than numb or avoid it, rather than just suppressing it or doing something that's further harmful to cope. And that has been really good. And I guess it hurts a little bit less every time, but like there's still just like the soul crushing pain in my chest and the sobbing and the, oh my goodness, I did not know that I could hurt this deep. But I think it's getting lesser, and my counselor informs me that that's what healing is. And so that's cool. And yeah, another thing that I do is just kind of like recognizing like within the triggers, like I guess like a way of acknowledging that I'm emotionally reacting to it from a younger, more childish space has been like kind of like having the language of like imagining like a baby Tobi that's kind of like inside myself, who I also need to take care of and I'm holding, but also like I don't feel responsible for that. So also God's holding both of us is kind of the mental image that I have. So I get to like reassure her that she's okay, and then God reassures me that I'm okay, and then everything's good. And so that's kind of like what it practically looks like in the moments of being triggered, of just like convincing myself it's like, you're okay, God's got it, you'll be all right, and kind of like offering, refusing to abandon myself in those triggers as I may have felt as though I was before. And so I think through this, I've been able to see a lot of healing in relationships as I'm looking for God to meet those needs, rather than looking to authority figures or others in my life who were not supposed to meet those needs. And so it actually just makes things a lot better when I'm not expecting them or wanting them to, and then being disappointed both in myself and in them when they don't. So that has definitely been big. And also, happens in littler steps of like acknowledging, like whether like in like specific relationships or in specific moments, it's just like, why do I want to text this person? Like when I like, what am I looking for here? And often it involves going back to the OG trauma, which feels unnecessary. It's like, what? Everything goes back to that? Yep, it just does. And so, so it can be tedious, but I think I'm definitely committed to this healing for the rest of my life. And it's been gratifying so far for the pain to be becoming lesser and for relationships to be improving. And to be just practicing, I guess, flexing the muscles and building those muscles of like turning to God immediately rather than turning to pornography or to fantasy worlds in which all of my needs are magically met, which doesn't necessarily happen in real life, but the peace and joy of them being met by God is also a lot deeper. And I think the consistency for me has been a huge thing, that it's not, that God doesn't change and that he is a very solid thing that I can run to has been big. And so that has been super good. And I've also found myself, I guess this time around in sobriety as well, that I'm less afraid of messing up as well, like less afraid of like breaking the streak, whereas like it kind of felt before as though like any moment you could be tempted and then you can slip and fall and it'll be awful and then you'll be back to square one. But I think I've been able to sit in the just kind of like joy and goodness of my identity in God, and that in the moments where I'm triggered, instead of like being like fearful or ashamed or like, oh no, if you mess up, you'll feel so horrible and you don't want to do that. It's actually like sitting in there like, actually, God meets your needs. And it's so much better than that cheap, horrible replica that you are looking to that will make you feel like trash. And that like the fullness that we have in this relationship with God is just straight up so much better and then fulfilling that I find myself not even wanting it. And so that has been super cool lately as well, to be sitting in that joy and fulfillment rather than shame and fear. So overall, I'd say what I've learned is that it's important to recognize the impact of trauma and hurt as a maintaining factor of addiction, that there is, I don't know how universal it is in other addictions. I know apparently trauma of abandonment is 100% in sex addiction, a lot of abuse and things like that. I don't know how that carries on to other spheres of addiction, but I guess for me, it's definitely been significant that there's a thing that I'm running away from and numbing, and that addiction is a way of, continuing that numbing. And so it's been important for me to acknowledge the pain of like my past self and to express compassion and to work on seeing myself through God's eyes, which is a slow process, and also see how he has been working and walking with me this whole time. And yeah, to be forgiving myself and letting go of shame, and overall just depending on God to meet my needs and trust that he is able to restore and renew us. And I've definitely seen that so far and look forward to walking this in the rest of my life. So yeah, thank you for having me and listening.